Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for coming this morning. I know there are many competing events, so I think I join Katie in being glad that you chose to devote your morning to contemporary Southeast Asian art. So I'm going to start the presentation by discussing just briefly the main threads of my new book, which Katie described. It just came out a few months ago in London. So I date the story from the very beginnings of the field when a few avant-garde artists in Southeast Asia were coming to the fore. Now, at the time that when they were producing, they were extremely unusual, and therefore they were not described as contemporary. But with 50 years of hindsight, which we now have, and which was one of the reasons I thought someone should write the book. So if I have students I teach, so they need this book, is that with hindsight, we can now see the patterns emerging from the 70s till today. And we see that there is a field, a coherent, strong field with certain clear characteristics, traits. So it's some of those traits that we'll be looking at in a second with the slides. And then we will culminate with a brief discussion of this exhibition, which features artists, all of whom really do deploy these key characteristics of contemporary Southeast Asian art. And this is why they're chosen for this exhibition, but also many of the artists in this show, in fact, all of them virtually are seminal players. They're big figures of the Southeast Asian contemporary art scene. So we're very privileged to be sitting here amongst these works, which I'll look at in a second. So a few brief framing notions here. Southeast Asia was mostly colonized. All right, so in the 19th century, or even before, in the case of the Philippines, the Europeans came to Southeast Asia and did their colonizing magic, which I'm being slightly amusing and facetious here, but what I mean is that Southeast Asia was imperialistically taken over, and what that meant was that Southeast Asia, which is very traditional in terms of material culture, has a very strong and ancient material culture, received modern painting from Europe, so paint on canvas. And that, of course, completely changed art in Southeast Asia. It added to the culture. It did not diminish the material culture that had always been in Southeast Asia from the pre-modern times, thousands of years old. This is important to remember because in this very exhibition, we'll see many artworks that have a kind of cultural memory of the traditions of Southeast Asia in terms of themes and in terms of forms and in terms of techniques and artistic strategies. That's important to remember. So art comes from the West in the late 20th century, for the most part, and spreads. And artists in Southeast Asia take on board modern painting from Europe, but they especially espouse figuration and the aesthetics of art that is the case in Europe. And what we see are artists conveying life in Southeast Asia with these new forms from Europe, these technologies and techniques that come from Europe. We see then a break, and it's the break that we'll be exploring. So from the 70s onwards, we see this break, and this is what we're going to sort of zoom into, but having given you this slight background. And what we do see, I reiterate, these are the conclusions of my book, which I explore 50 years of art from 8 countries, 180 artists, including virtually all of the artists in this exhibition are included in the book, so they're key figures of the field. We see this carry through of innovations that existed already in snatches in the 70s. And so this is why we can call it a field today that is distinct, I think, from Chinese contemporary art. It has some, of course, there are parallels, but I do think it is a distinctive field within the global contemporary. So what do I mean? Let's flash back quickly to early modern painting in Southeast Asia. What do we note here? These are works from around the region, Indonesia and Vietnam and Singapore and the Philippines, just as examples. We see a keen interest in local scenes and figuration and life. And this is what I want you to note, because this is the one thing that does carry through from the modern. Artists interested in depicting life. So the connection between culture and life in Southeast Asia was always supreme. That's in fact the case all over the world. But in the the West, this was ruptured somewhat with modernism and the contemporary in the West. So that isn't not what happens in Southeast Asia. So this is why I want to show you this. Coming up to the mid-century, we come into this very key post-colonial period in Southeast Asia. The Singaporeans, the Malaysians, Indonesians, and the Burmese, and so forth, and the Vietnamese they all managed to boot out their colonial overlords. Thailand was never colonized, but nevertheless, they had something of a colonial mentality because of various historical reasons. So what we see at mid-century are very optimistic paintings depicting these new nations. But the thing is that all is not well in Southeast Asia. The peoples of Southeast Asia have fought very hard sometimes in very bloody wars, including in Indonesia, in Burma, in Malaya as well. Vietnam, of course, is probably the most famous of the colonial wars, with the First Indochina War that ended with the Vietnamese defeating the French in 1954. All is not well, because what happens is after these wars, the countries draw into the national period. They form new national governments, which are supposed to be for the people. But in fact, this is the truth of what is happening in Southeast Asia in the 70s. So, in other words, this colonial optimism, post-colonial optimism, is in fact underpinned by a great deal of political violence all over Southeast Asia. So whether this is in Cambodia in the 70s, I'm sure you're familiar with the Khmer Rouge genocide. Indonesia, after emancipation, barely a decade after emancipation, there are bloody uprisings where a great deal of political violence is inflicted on the left-wing people of Indonesia, including many Chinese. People say there were nearly 1 million people killed. Malaya erupts into violence, communal violence, Chinese versus Muslims in the Malay Peninsula. So all is not well. In the Philippines, we have the Marcos dictatorship taking over in 1972. So in other words, there are many, many frictions, tensions, and the promise of the national era has not materialized. So how do artists convey that? That is the question. Many artists don't convey that. They choose to make commercial paintings, still lives, floral bouquets, portraits, etc. But some artists take up the challenge of engaging with this friction that is clearly all around, everywhere, and that everyone is subjected to. 2 points here. Number one, they want to talk to their fellow citizens. So they're not making these few people, these are very few people. Malaysian artist, FX Harsono, who's one of the early pioneers in Indonesia, whose work we are very privileged to have in the back room. So after the talk, you can all have a look at that. So very few around Southeast Asia take up this challenge. They want to speak to ordinary people. Not museum people, not us. We are elites. Here in this gallery this morning, we are all elites. Anybody interested in an art talk in Hong Kong is manifestly an elite. They actually want to talk to the bigger people, the more people. Why? Because what they're discussing are problems, tensions that everyone is subjected to. These are not problems of an elite, they are problems of the whole country. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the problems they're describing are very complicated. So how do you do that? You can't paint that. It's difficult to paint that. Third point, most important point. If they start to critique the system, politics, the government, the regime, what will happen to them in these countries of Southeast Asia in the mid-70s? None of these countries are free. All of them are autocracies at that point. Yes, we agree? The Philippines has just been taken over by Marcos. Was elected in the 60s, but he instituted military dictatorship in 72, martial law. Indonesia is under a military dictatorship. Singapore is extremely tightly controlled by the government, and dissidents go to jail. This is the truth of it. And so forth. Communist Vietnam in the 60s is in the middle of war. So this is what the artists are trying to engage with. So they make new works of this kind. Installation art that it makes you uncomfortable, and especially art that engages the viewer into the issue. You cannot be passive with these works. You are designed to engage with them. These are not about being admired from a distance. You cannot separate yourself from these artworks. This is the change in the language of art that occurred in the 70s. That's the root of Southeast Asian contemporary art. So let's move forward and see a work I emphasized by F.X. Harsono, who's our artist at the back. So it's extraordinary that someone like Harsono was a pioneer in the 70s and still is working today, still making brilliant work today that has changed in terms of thematics, but not in terms of power and command, in terms of the forms, in terms of the iconographies, and the way he engages the audiences. And maybe you can tell me if you agree. Later on, you can have a look at the work at the back, which I'll discuss at the end of the talk. In the 70s already, F.X. Harsono was conceptualizing artworks that engaged people, and in this case, he engaged audiences via the title of the work. So we already see in the 70s that in Southeast Asia, artists are using text, image, signs to bring the audience in to the ideas that are complicated. In this case, what he's talking about is the rampant militarization of Indonesia. There are guns absolutely everywhere. This is a rural country, a very traditional country, a country with many different religions and languages, islands, and all over the place, the pervasive image are guns. This has never been seen in Indonesia. This is a rural country, a peaceful country on the whole. And so how do you discuss that? And who's responsible for these guns? Why are the guns everywhere? And what kind of agency do we, the people, have vis-a-vis the regime? However autocratic a regime is, and this is where we get into Katie's introduction, beauty will save the world. However hard the situation is, however autocratic, everyone still has agency. And this is what the artists believe. And so in a minute, we'll discuss Htein Lin at the back. But already in the 70s, Harsono has created an artwork where he's asking you to write something in a book in response to these pink guns. A brilliant, seminal artwork today in the National Gallery, Singapore. And this work can be reconfigured in many ways. The point of the work, it's a conceptual work. So all these works are conceptually underpinned. They're both aesthetic, but also very conceptual. So that is also different to Western art, where conceptual art is often very minimalist and where the object often disappears. In this case, the object is very present. Aesthetics are very present. This exhibition is a kind of corroboration of these theories, of these traits. So it's both beautiful, but also engages you via association. So it's conceptual, and you write in the little book something. Text, very important. Jakarta, 1975, and we see artists responding to this dichotomy. Asia is modernizing. This is true in China. It's also true in South Asia. So all the points I'm making are somewhat applicable to all Asia. So even if you've never been to Southeast Asia, some of you perhaps have not, you will know that this contradiction between modernity and tradition and poverty is rampant and pervasive all over South Asia to this day in some places, even in the far-flung countrysides of China. This is true. How do you express that? How do you express that? You express that, and how do you not only tell about that, but ask about that? These artists are asking you to think about these things. They're not actually telling you anything. So you express that by combining different types of images. In this case, a very traditional sculpture from the Majapahit, who are an ancient civilization of Java, with a very modern, Western-looking, slightly lewd, provocative image. This was 1975 and could have been censored, but it wasn't, because some of the images all strive to be somewhat playful and elusive. They're cryptic. They don't say it directly. They ask you to figure it out from the image. All these works demand that you do the work. So they're beautiful, they draw you in, but then you're expected to actually do something. Read them and see the layering inside. We move forward. Here we are in the Philippines. Artists who do not know each other. But here in this case, Imelda, Kahipe Andaya, who was born in the 40s, so she's a young woman at this point, a young artist. There is no model for this work. This is text-based, but she's also bringing in ethnographic imagery, photographs. None of this has been done before. Most of her compatriots are at this point making social realist pictures, oils. So this is very new. These are prints. She's juxtaposing a different number of signs, all in the interest of conveying to you hierarchical social discrepancies within Filipino society, the condition of women, but also the condition of the original populations of Philippines who are indigenous and who are not the families, the sort of moneyed, landed families of the Philippines who are very wealthy and who keep the wealth to themselves. So these works are driving you to think about class distinctions, money distinctions, and the difficulty of moving from one class to the other in the Philippines. These are big social questions. They're difficult social questions, and they're certainly social questions that the government is not keen for the citizens to be thinking about, because all this ultimately is to do with power and how officials, how the official governments and so on keep people in check, and in Marcos Philippines, so in the mid-70s. So we've already seen just a few works, but from these very few works, we understand certain things. We see them today with our eyes in 2025, we see already, we can discern certain traits emerging, and we'll see that these traits are all incipient in these works here in the gallery. We see that artists are juggling high and low culture. We see that they are dealing with modern and pre-modern sources. We see that they're dealing with local and foreign imagery, that they bring all these into play. And we especially see that they are using for legibility, because again, I repeat, they're interested to talk to you, all of us. They use vernacular languages, and this is what we see here in the gallery as well. They're using these types of forms or imagery that are deeply rooted in the culture and have been for thousands of years, actually. So they are doing what the Chinese did not do, because of the Cultural Revolution. They are very much utilizing everything from tradition that is very much still alive in the culture. Second of all, they're thinking about participation and public space. They're thinking about how to get their works, to circulate their works out into the public space, the civic public space, but also the physical public space. And in terms of themes, and this does not change from Dinh Q's work here to Moe Satt's work here, Htein Lin's work, and Josephine's work there, Vũ Dân Tann's work over here, and Harsono's work behind. We see that they continue to be interested in politics, social violence of different types, history and how history is used and abused by authority to, again, control, shape. Nationalism is a concern. Josephine's work is looking at that at the back. Ethnic frictions. This is Harsono's work on the other side. And state power and abuses of state power. This is Htein Lin's work at the back. So this is, from the 70s onwards, these artists are interested in these topics. They remain omnipresent and foundational today. This is Singapore, last year. This is to prove my point that tradition is still absolutely entrenched, even in modern, super wealthy Singapore. This is burning papers for ghost festivals in Singapore. You will recognize this. This is today. This is Vietnam today, okay? Ceramics and all sorts of vernacular, what we call crafts, so low art. Cultural wares are still omnipresent in Vietnam today. I show you these images because in a minute we'll be seeing works by Bùi Công Khánh. They're ceramics. There's a reason why. They're not trying to be new, and they innovate, but the innovation is less with the materials and more with what they do with them. Now we're going to go on a very quick tour until we come up to the works in this exhibition. So this is very rapid to show you how artists are interested in pagan animism and so forth. This is very iconoclastic in Thailand in the early 80s. Most of the artists were making proto-Buddhist royal, what Apinan Poshinanda calls consensus art. So art going along with the system and with authority. This is very much the opposite of that. Philippines, artists talking about history and really thinking about history in terms of the meaning of history today in a very critical way. But always good looking, always aestheticized, and always designed for you to be brought into the work with lots of text for you to read. As soon as you have to read, by the way, you're doing some work. You're not being allowed to be passive within the space of art. Tang Da Wu, this is Singapore, vernacular again. He's using shadow puppetry to talk about foreign labor in Singapore. So foreign labor in Singapore, that's a topic. How do you depict that? It's very difficult to depict that. But if you're using vernacular language such as shadow puppetry, you can convey very critical ideas to the audience such that the audience has to actually think about how Singapore is becoming very rich in the 80s, and instead of being very poor as it had previously been, it is not only becoming consumerist and rich, but it's using the poor people of the regional countries as labor. That's a thing. It's a tension, and it's something that the artist invites you to think about and using these particular forms. So all these things are not random. It's not that the artists are going back nostalgically to old forms. They are using old forms to go forward as a means, as a hook, to get the audience interested in these topics that are complicated and sometimes a little bit unpleasant. These are not pretty still lives. These are not beautiful images, but they're nevertheless very aesthetic. Tang Da Wu, in this case, using public space. Very important, this idea that you would use civic space, which is history, and public space, which is the street. This is Hanoi, again, in mid-90s, artists using the street. Classical painting, but not really, because the iconography is about queer rights in Vietnam. I can assure you this was a huge taboo. But the work was up for a few hours, then of course censored and taken down, but the artist uses the street. This is an old methodology, if you like, an obvious methodology, but a very brazen, daring methodology in communist Vietnam in the 90s in Hanoi. Different kind of civic space. This is the public library in Chiang Mai in Thailand, early 90s. This is an artist making very beautiful work with photography and bottles. All this is very original. There is no model in Western art. It's not that they're copying art in New York. There is no such thing. Why is there no such thing in New York? Because no one in New York cares about the issues that these artists are dealing with. The issues are distinctly Southeast Asian, and the forms are distinctly Southeast Asian. But the artist did not put this in a museum. It was in the public library. It's designed for everyone. This, by the way, has ended up in a big public collection, I think in Singapore. And all these artists, by the way, are collected by NGS in Singapore, by Fukuoka in Japan, by Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane, and so on. So all these artists are today recognized as the important people of the field. The street, again, this is Manit. Aramayani from Indonesia. This is not the street, this is again using very traditional imagery from dance, but juxtaposing this in a very incongruous image to talk about Indonesia and all the tensions occurring in 96. Vernacular language. This is an artist looking at the massacre of Chinese people in 1965-66 in Indonesia at the time of the transition between the Sukarno and the Suharto government in 1965. But he doesn't just paint it. He uses terracotta in this kind of mound. So very simple, but at the same time original, but you also have to think about using these materials that are from the local culture, that are unpretentious. They speak of low art, but in fact they hook you because any farmer in Indonesia who sees this work will understand the work. And yet the themes that are being looked at are complicated and taboo. Jakai, streaming forward to our current day, another artist this time from Thailand, but using textile and embroidery. These are the quintessential low art vernacular materials and methods that ever to do with Muslim discrimination in the south of Thailand. And bringing you up to the present day, before I launch into discussion of these artists in this exhibition, to show you that artists still in Singapore, and she's very young, Priya, I think she was born in the 90s, so still young artists today are still using these vernacular forms, so vernacular being gold, which is a symbol in all Asian cultures, but she's put this on a staircase in an HDB apartment complex. HDBs are government apartments in Singapore controlled by the government. So this was immediately taken down, censored. Okay, and again, cryptic. This is not a critique of exactly of anything, but she's subverting the system. She's essentially intruding, hijacking public space with something aesthetic, but the idea is for people to question what the HDB is, what it represents in terms of social organization and social construct by the state. Okay, so, but always good looking. Now we come to the first artwork that is not actually in this gallery now, but will be after the fair, will be in the gallery. This is an artwork that's represented at Chancery Lane's booth at Art Basel by Vũ Dân Tân, who's the most senior of the artists in this exhibition. He was born in 1946. And to show you what conceptual art in the 90s looks like in Southeast Asia. So this is money, or pseudo-money. These are small bills, okay, little small bills that were made as a way to discuss many things that are going on in Vietnam, but also are true to the region. This work actually, even though it was made in Vietnam and somewhat references Hong Kong, because this is Hong Kong money. He made it after he came back from Hong Kong, where he had been in 97, at a key date. For those in the audience from Hong Kong, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that 1997 is a very key date in Hong Kong history. He made it in response to Hong Kong, but also he's thinking about money and globalization and capitalism in 1990s Vietnam, which is a big deal because remember that the Vietnamese fought the Americans for over a decade, well over a decade, for 20 years, a very bloody war, a civil war against the South, but aided by the Americans, to regain control of the whole country for this in the name of the communist state. They defeated capitalism. But in 1986, Vietnam turns capitalism. So effectively, they remain a communist country, but they change their economic system 180 degrees. So that's, again, a thing that created a lot and still is creating a great deal of social friction in Vietnam. And how do you depict that? How do you talk about that? How do you actually engage your audience on those issues that are critical issues in Vietnam? They're not just about money. It's really about how society's been completely reformed, reshaped in Vietnam after the 80s, with class divides coming again, which were supposed to be abolished by the communist system. So in a way, this work could apply to China as well. So how does he do it? He makes these money images that could be traded. So again, he's thinking a little bit about civic space, crossing borders, engaging people with this idea that people could just handle the money, that the money is produced by the government, but that everyone has agency to involve themselves in the state and in how the state is run. The work is very good looking. It's sort of funny. You look at it, oh, this is funny, fake money. But actually, when you start to think about it, what he's talking about are very important and difficult concepts. And I think the work is effective in that sense. Charlie Chaplin was an independent. He was a figure, of course, of silent cinema, but he was also very well known for being outside the system and for being independent and for taking agency in his own hands. Anybody who knows the story of Charlie Chaplin in America knows that he was actually viewed as a communist and purged by the McCarthyist regime that was in existence in Washington in the 1950s. Here are the close-ups of the works. And you can see how much humor is in all this. These are little works, but they are all aimed for you to decode. Like everything in this room, they're designed for you to look at and think. So they do their job on a critical level, but they're also fun and good looking and layered and full of joy. So beauty will save the world, but at the same time, asking you to think about the world and ultimately shape your own world. More works by Vũ Dân Tân that unfortunately have disappeared. So these artists, none of them in the room, all of them in the room are in the same boat, ultimately make work because they believe in art as a medium for social intervention in a sense, and for beauty, and for their fellow human being. None of these artists are primarily commercial, or in fact at all commercial, even though they are being shown and for sale in a commercial gallery. There's a paradox for you. So this is a work that was a performance work. Streets of Hanoi, Cadillac, all the things that involves in terms of representation of America coming to Hanoi, gold, money, etc. Works that are in the exhibition, these fashion series, there are several in the fair and several in the gallery. He's thinking in a fun but also quite serious way about what consumerism means in the late 90s in Hanoi, but also all over Asia. And he makes these very beautiful handmade sculptural works, which could be worn like this. So these artists are pluridisciplinary. They don't stop at just painting or sculpture or one medium. They mix everything up. Why? Because in the culture, in the pre-modern culture of Southeast Asia, artists always were never defined by one medium. That's a very Western thing. So the artists are harking back to the absence of rules. And because they're contemporary avant-garde artists, they are not interested in rules. They are making their own rules. And they're essentially making works to fit the moment, to fit the times, and to respond to the times and to engage the times. So all these artworks are active artworks. Dinh Q, a work that was made for a market in Saigon, public space. And the discourse was public space. This is about Agent Orange being dropped in Vietnam in the 1960s by the Americans. That's a public discourse. That's a problem that belongs to everyone in Vietnam, and in fact belongs in some ways to everyone in the United States. He displays this work in the public market, not in a museum, not in an art gallery. It's designed to intervene in the public space such that the public can involve themselves in this question. And I believe this artwork has been acquired, or at least the dolls that came out of it, by either MoMA or one of the big Western institutions. Dinh Q is the same artist as I have behind me. Suti Kunavichayanot from Thailand, who I think has just come through the door, interestingly enough. Also interested in public space, two types of public space in this case. The public space of the street, but also the public space of history. What he's describing on the desktops are taboo histories of Thailand that are out of the history books. So in Thailand, in the history books of kids, of students at school, this incident of state violence against the people is not described. So this is a way, these artworks are designed as a way for normal people to reclaim agency over their own history, which has been moved aside. Dinh Q. When I said vernacular, this is what I mean, vernacular. You can see it here. He has imitated with these photographic weavings the straw mats that are still pervasive all around Southeast Asia today. So he's used a technique that he observed in the village as a child to weave together photographs. But this is not just random weaving for the sake of the form. This is a weaving together of U.S. Film culture revolving around Vietnam. So America's view, America's perspective on Vietnam via Hollywood. So he's taken Hollywood stills from various Hollywood movies, The Deer Hunter and so forth, and woven them quite literally together with images of the Vietnamese themselves taken by the Vietnamese. So he's brought real pictures of Vietnam together with fictional projections of Vietnam, two cultures, two types of images, two realities brought together in one highly aestheticized but highly critical and quite brilliant work of art. This concept, how artists in Southeast Asia use form, technique, technologies, even from the village, to critically discuss reality in Asia, which is not simple. We're all very westernized, but at the same time, are we and should we be, and how should we be looking at that critically, all of us, Eastern and Western alike? Bùi Công Khánh an artist also in this exhibition. This is his work. This is the work I'm sitting on to show you how these artists are also playing with the idea of not just playing, but maybe even critiquing or resisting the idea of Western art as a painting that on the wall that you cannot touch. Many of them make artworks that you can touch and that you can use, and they're crossing that boundary from the artwork as the passive subject of the gaze to the artwork that is part of your life, just as it was in pre-modern culture. So artists are often not consciously doing that, but they do that, and as the art historian, it's your job to see what they're doing and to connect that to the bigger culture and to then recognize that this is not the kind of work that would have been made in New York. It's a kind of work that's really speaking to local culture, drawing from local culture, but also speaking critically about the contemporary world that we live in. In this case, a textile work that he created some years ago to think about military violence in Myanmar. Some ceramics, and Bùi Công Khánh is extremely well known for ceramics. There is one in the window here, which is extraordinary because it's huge. But these are not mimicries of old ceramics. They're using the form of ceramic art and porcelain art, which is very, very old in Asia, of course in China notably, but also in Vietnam, to reflect on current events and geopolitics in Southeast Asia. In this case, these relations. These are works that were in exhibition in this gallery several years ago in 2015. And a work that's in this current show, more ceramics, more porcelain, vernacular, craft medium, but not really, used really as a way of thinking about war. When he made this work in 2018, the world is relatively peaceful. Today, unfortunately, this piece speaks to our contemporary reality where Russia and Ukraine are at war, where there are many civil wars erupting all over Africa, where the Middle East is absolutely erupting. So unfortunately, war never seems to be very far away. But in this case, he's thinking about he's weighing what it means to sacrifice for war, and then the medal and what the state gives you in return. The state gives you this little medal. So it's both beautiful, tactile, but also highly critical, but designed to make you think about these things. So it doesn't tell you anything. You must do the work to think about it. We have in the window another gorgeous ceramic vase. In this case, he's thinking about mythology. So Chinese and Vietnamese mythology are somewhat similar, not exactly the same, but of course, Vietnam is known as a Sinicized culture. So he's using this form, Vietnamese and Chinese, but at the same time to think a little bit about Vietnamese reality, but at the same time his own personal response to Vietnam today in the form of these hearts, mechanical hearts, which represent him. So he's there, the state is there, culture is there with the mythology, all that in this stunning work of art that you cannot ignore. It's very beautiful. You go up close to it and then you start to decode it. All these works require decoding. I am sitting on this artwork, as you can see, made with jackfruit wood. So this is an indigenous wood of central Vietnam used for cooking. So people eat jackfruit. They have jackfruit in their garden, and they also use the hardwood that is jackfruit. It's a very precious wood, a bit like Huanghuali in China. It's heavy, but he's used it to carve, as you can see here, this is barbed wire, which represents the Americans in Vietnam during the war. He has images of a hand grenade in there. It's a reflection, north-south, the chairs are north and south. It's a reflection on Vietnam today and the fact that despite the war, the civil war that went on for two decades, the country has yet to really resolve its issues. North and south are still quite polarized, but it's not telling you that, it lets you discover that through the work. But it's also a work that can encroach into your domestic space. So essentially what he's saying is these issues, not only have they not gone away, but they really are part of our life. And here's a detail of that. And you can see the exquisite quality of the carving. This is him, hand carving. He has not given this out to be done by a factory. He's done it himself. how he's using these very ancient craft strategies or craft techniques that are in the culture that everyone will recognize. Every granddad in the countryside in Asia still carves, I guess. I've seen them on the roadsides in Bali, using wood that it will be familiar in central Vietnam, but describing something that is probably less familiar or should be familiar, but it's more intellectual. So it's an idea that he's talking about. So he's using these familiar objects to get into that. Josephine Turalba, who is here today, luckily, she's somewhere way over there, from Manila, who some years ago very brilliantly conceptualized these performative shoe wear, which we have here in the gallery, which you're all invited. When we've cleared the chairs in a minute, you can use them and you can post them. They're designed, again, like Khan's work, they're designed to be used, but they're also a reflection on state violence and general violence in the Philippines. They're made out of bullets, all out of bullets. And I can assure you they're very painful to wear. So when you wear them, which you're designed to do, you will experience them as pain. And that is the point. That makes you think about gun violence, gun culture. Do we need gun culture? Okay, the Philippines is like America, guns everywhere. And here they are again being used. So these methodologies, by the way, are not learned in books. They come out of local necessity. They're driven by, there's no artist in the West making this kind of stuff, or it really is coming out of the imagination of the artist and the context of the artist, which is specific to Southeast Asia. The work that we have behind, this is a recent work commissioned for this exhibition, so 2025. This is leather and bullet cartridges and actual bits of bullets as well, commenting on geopolitics in our region, in the South China Sea, about the countries of Southeast Asia and Asia, and how they're dealing with their current interests in the geologies and the minerals and the wealth of and the passage, if we like, of the seas, but also the response of the underwater world to these frictions. All that is designed to bring you into the question yourself and to so that you can interrogate what's actually going on in a more critical way, but through beauty. These works are all very good looking. Moe Satt, at the back, commissioned for this exhibition. This is an artist who was incarcerated in Yangon in 2021 after the military took back the country after about a decade of somewhat approaching something called democracy, but not really. The military came back after they had been in power since the beginning of the nation state in Burma. And he was now in political exile in the Netherlands. So this is a meditation on what it means to lose your home, to how you engage with the new home, what your roots are, who you are in a new place. All this is done very expressively through the face, the hands, in a very, very classical way, the human body. Moe Satt is an artist who always uses his body. He's a performance artist. This series is an older series and captures him in 2018 in a very different mood. So we can see in these two different series the shift in his environment, but he's nevertheless using the body. This is the most basic and classic of artistic tools that is universal across all nations, all continents, but is especially true in Southeast Asia, where performance, dance, and so on was always very central to cultural expression all over Southeast Asia. And to this day, actually, even in the countrysides, in the rural parts of Southeast Asia, people use dance, movement, sound in secular and sacred manifestations of culture. And nearly closing. This is a video work that is this. Usually it's being screened on the screen, so I've hijacked Din's work for a moment, and after I'm done, we'll be screening his work back on this screen. A very short but elegant video work that is both beautiful and rather disquieting. by Din, and really it's a commentary about sex tourism in Vietnam, but also in Asia. It's both critical and beautiful, so I will leave you in a few minutes to decode the work yourself. And last but not least, before we finish up, I wanted to say a few words about the work at the back. You can read the text. I think there's some text in the QR code there as well. But essentially, this is Harsono, who was here for a few days ago but had to leave. So he came to town to install the work. This is a new commission for the exhibition. And this is a commemorative memorial meditation on victims, but also how they transcend. These were victims of purges that occurred in the late 40s in Indonesia at a very, very fluxy time when the Javanese were fighting once again with the Dutch after the Second World War. The Dutch had come back after the Japanese had left Java and were trying to reclaim their colony. In the end, they did not succeed. In 1949, the Indonesians actually won their war of independence. But for the couple of years before that, there was a great deal of tumult particularly in Java, a lot of battles, and the Chinese the Chinese population, who are a minority in Indonesia and have been for many, many generations, were used as pawns. Minorities are often, unfortunately, suffer the brunt of these moments of instability, political instability, and there were a number of victims, Chinese victims of these at this particular moment in history. They were buried in a mass grave, and then they were disinterred some years later and given proper Chinese burials. The kernel of the work comes from these incidents in history. But I argue in my catalog text that the artist, with his work, transcends the specific kind of incident. Even he's part Chinese. He's Chinese himself. He's Chinese Indonesian. So of course, it's partly to do with his own biography. But the work speaks far more universally to the redemption and the transcendence of these ugly incidents in history. To think about a more universalist, spiritual way of thinking about the ugly incidents of the past and victimhood and death and so forth. And he thinks about the spirits of these people being reborn, eternally reborn through his work. So on that note, this concludes my talk. And I'll take questions for a few minutes if there are any. But otherwise, thank you so much for being a gracious audience.